Don't repeat this because the stones still remember, but in the heart of Tenochtitlan, a man once walked to his death after spending a final night with 4 brides, crowned with flowers and certainty. The guards outside didn't knock. They waited with rope and a blade of volcanic glass while the flutes he carried snapped one by one across the temple steps. What you're about to hear was never meant to be told plainly. In the Aztec world, desire wasn't private pleasure. It was a lever. It was chained, sanctified, spent, and harvested by the state. Listen closely. Once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it, anywhere. Before we descend deeper into these forbidden corridors, if you value history stripped of its masks, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see this brotherhood of seekers stretch across states and oceans. Your voice turns this channel into a map of hidden minds. Here's the key most people never pick up. Empires don't run only on laws and swords. They run on human appetites managed like a treasury. The Mexica, the people we call the Aztecs, engineered sexuality into a system of cosmic accounting. Who you touched, when you touched, whether you abstained, whether you confessed, whether you were rewarded or destroyed for your impulses. These were public matters woven into ritual calendars, school codes, tribute lists, and the breath of priests. Their rulers drew a straight line from your most private urges to the sun's daily rise, and that they convinced millions that the two were inseparable. It worked, until it didn't. Start with the most chilling performance of power I know, the living image of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of night, fate, and the relentless gaze. Each year, a flawless youth was chosen to be his walking reflection. He wasn't a victim in chains, he was a celebrity crafted by ceremony. Musicians followed him, people bowed. He had 4 wives with names of goddesses, silks that floated, and the scent of flowers wherever he stepped. Power's seduction wasn't subtle, it was absolute. And then, at the appointed hour, he climbed the steps, broke his flutes, and surrendered his life. Not because the blade was strong, but because the story was stronger. Final pleasures were never about pleasure. They were baited hooks cast by institutions that understood the male mind. Reward, status, intimacy, then the cut. A lesson etched into the city. The temple grants what it can take. On the other side of the coin stood Tlazolteotl, eater of filth and forgiver of sins, the confessor goddess whose priests cleaned the soul like a ledger once and only once. Understand the psychology. A lifetime pass for indulgence would collapse the system. A single absolution, secured by ceremony, bound the penitent to the temple forever. Confession wasn't a private whisper between equals. It was a contract under supervision. You emerged purified, marked by grace and recorded. You owed the institution that reshaped your shame into order. That is how control works when it's elegant. It doesn't only punish, it relieves, on terms that produce loyalty and leverage. This wasn't chaos disguised as religion. It was an educational program with teeth. The Kalmakak for nobles and the Telpochkali for commoners trained young men and women with an austerity that would make a military camp blush. Abstinence wasn't a sermon, it was enforcement. Break vows, seek unauthorized partners, disrupt the channeling of vitality into war and ritual, and you faced humiliations, disfigurements, or death. Haircut, clothes stripped, bodies marked, reputations salted into the plaza dust. Adultery, especially within the ordered web of kin and alliance, wasn't private business, it was sabotage. The punishments were public theatre with a single message: your body is a conduit for the city's stability. Spill outside the sanctioned channels and you pay with everything. Now look at the market side. The Ahuyanime, pleasant ones, courtesans trained in songs and conversation, weren't random vice. They formed a social valve for elite men, a soft architecture of influence packaged as charm. Marriages themselves were engineered by councils. Provinces were required to send women in tribute. Alliances were sealed by giving and receiving bodies like signatures. Consent, as we define it, collapsed under the weight of obligation and hierarchy. In this frame, intimacy is currency minted by the state. And yes, much of what we know comes through Spanish eyes, loaded with moral agendas. But even when we strip out exaggeration, a hardcore remains. The empire orchestrated desire with deliberate care, and that orchestration advanced power. Consider the blood. Mesoamerican devotion often demanded bloodletting as proof of vow and vehicle of prayer. Tongue, ear, and yes, in some cases male organs, pierced with agave spines or obsidian, then drawn with thorns or cords to mark a covenant between flesh and cosmos. It wasn't pornography, it was accounting. The message to men: redirect your force toward the sun, the maize, the war god's drum. Private appetite yields to public offering. This is not comfort. It's control through sacrifice, made meaningful by myth and mandatory by law. Fertility itself wore a mask of sweetness over steel. In festivals for youthful goddesses of maize and renewal, women were dressed as brides, garlanded, perfumed, escorted like queens. The wedding was celebration and spectacle, the city pretending to marry the earth so the fields would answer in abundance. But the vows ended in a knife. The image of the bride was not protected by romance, it was consumed by ritual. In one stroke, the culture carved a lesson into men and women alike. Love, fecundity, and death aren't separate rooms. They are a corridor you walk under supervision. And the door at the end is always the temple's. At this point, the tourist version usually pivots to demonize or excuse. We won't do either. We will look at sources, codices, the Florentine project of Sahagun, the chronicles of Duran, knowing they were written under conquest to persuade, to justify, to save souls or secure funding. We will also read the stones, the laws, and the logistics of empire. Both sides distort, when convenient, and beneath both lies a truth that bites. The Aztec state transformed sexuality into infrastructure. That isn't a moral judgment, it is a diagnosis of power. If you're feeling a chill, good. You're noticing that the mechanism isn't ancient at all. Institutions still promise absolution. Once. Leaders still sanctify a chosen few with short-lived privileges to make everyone else stay in line. Systems still punish private appetite when it threatens public order, yet sell you curated outlets as healthy. The faces have changed. The mirror has not. In that obsidian, you can see the priest's torchlight and the screen in your hand. Both glow, both instruct, both reward and remove. We're going to keep descending. Past the murals and the myths, past the easy outrage and the easy denial. We'll trace the pathways where intimacy became a leash, where marriage was a military strategy, where confession was a contract, and where the last night before sacrifice was the most exquisite trap an empire ever set. This is not entertainment. It's a map of how power harvests men, one desire at a time. Keep your eyes open. The stairs get narrower from here. Every appetite had a leash. You learned to fast until the mouth felt like ash, to watch the moon while your blood pooled into paper strips from the tongue and ear, to sleep on reed mats that bit the skin. You learned that abstinence before war sharpened your spirit like a blade. Break the code, seek unsanctioned beds, spill what was pledged to the god of the drum. And you didn't just face personal shame. You threatened harvest, weather, victory. The punishments were designed not just to hurt, but to brand. Hair shorn, clothes stripped, body pierced and paraded. Reputation, the currency that buys allies, burned to cinders in the square. That's how a state educates men. It engraves the lesson on the skin, then lets the crowd read. You've been told desire is private. The Mexica taught the opposite, that it was civic, cosmic, taxable. They did not leave marriage to chance. Courts arranged unions to braid lineages and territories into rope. The ceremony looked tender to the untrained eye. Hands bound with woven cloth, breath of copal, elders chanting words that had crushed rebellions before you were born. But marriage was a treaty, not a romance. A noblewoman could seal a border more effectively than stone. Provinces sent women to the capital as living bonds, and the ruler's house took them in. Some as wives, some as honoured companions, some as servants who had become necessary threads in the web of influence. The lesson: kinship is infrastructure. Passion is a fuel line the state routes where it wants. On market days, another theatre of control opened its painted eyes. The ahuyanime, courtesans trained in songs, poetry, and the choreography of presence, moved like soft weather among merchants and captains, ambassadors and admirals. They were not mere sellers of touch. They were instruments of social pressure and political listening posts, with obligations upward and outward, governed by rules that protected the powerful and punished the reckless. Their houses sat in the city like velvet snares, and men who entered knew, even if they would not say it, that the temple's gaze followed them, in and out. A smile well placed could redirect a favour. A rumour captured over wine could save a campaign or end a rival. This was sexual economy as statecraft. Curated release to preserve a larger grip. You want horror? It doesn't always look like gore. Sometimes it looks like perfection. Consider the year-long preparation of a living goddess image. A woman, selected with care, coached in grace, dressed in flowers and finery, carried through the city with songs you couldn't shake loose if you tried. She learned weaving and sweeping, the sacred crafts of order, until her hands knew patterns that outlived empires. People greeted her with reverence because she wasn't simply herself. She was the town's fertility wearing a face. She became for a season the earth's maiden, the harvester's bride. The celebration ended not with a kiss, but with a blade. Her body, once lifted on shoulders, became the raw material of renewal. A priest wore her skin as a second garment. A truth so intimate, it still rings like a struck bell. The state performed a coup on the human mind. It made beauty into a countdown and devotion into obedience. You may protest. This is filtered through conquest. Your right to be suspicious. The chroniclers, friars like Sahagun and Duran, wrote under the shadow of empire, often to justify the new order and demonize the old. There is propaganda baked into the ink. But the codices, the laws, the stones and the rhythms of daily life corroborate a core architecture. Strict sexual codes, public punishments, institutionalized alliances through marriage, sanctioned venues for pleasure that fed information upward, and ritual substitutions where a season of indulgence for a chosen few culminated in sacrifice. Strip away the missionary sermon and you still see the machine. Law-backed ritual like a second spear. Adultery wasn't unfortunate. It was treason against lineage. Punishments in the Central Valley were severe. Strangulation, stoning, sometimes execution by clubs, sometimes public humiliation that outlived the body. Incest was annihilated at the root. Sexual violence wasn't negotiated, but erased. Rapists faced death because the crime wasn't framed as private harm. It was seen as tearing the fabric that held families to obligations, fields to tribute, soldiers to banners. Same with exploitation cloaked as intimacy. The state's position was brutally clear. Anything that destabilized the flow of inheritance, labor, and loyalty would be punished until memory itself recoiled. Now watch the opposing force, mercy engineered to bind. Tlazolteotl, devourer of filth, presided over a confession that could be made once, a single time to pour your hidden stain into the earth and walk away clean. Do you understand the genius? Men who feared the trap waited until age wintered their hair, thinking a late confession would spare them. Others came young, couldn't bear the weight, and promised the goddess they'd never return to the same sin. The priest recorded, remembered, absolved. And then the forgiven man became a client of the temple. Forgiveness created allegiance. Power knows. You never own a man like the man you saved. Even the bath was political. The temazcal, steam hut, was rebirth and regulation at once. Healers oversaw purification, after work, after war, after birth. Elders enforced abstinence and sanctioned unions. Midwives became officers in the republic of bloodlines. Every step from desire to reproduction had witnesses. Even privacy had a door with a name on it, and the name led up the pyramid. When you walk the great causeways of Tenochtitlan, in your mind it's easy to dwell on the shock value. Skulls on racks, rivers of petals washed red. But if you stop there, you miss the central mastery. The Mexica did what every durable power does. They embedded control in pleasure, and they clothed coercion in ritual so dense it felt like meaning itself. Warriors abstained before campaign not just out of reverence, but because the city needed their voltage unspent. Husbands stayed loyal not because jealousy is poetic, but because the dynasty needed clarity of inheritance. Courtesans entertained not simply to delight, but to harvest information and create obligations. Chosen figures enjoyed the sweetest fruit so that, when cut, the sight would instruct millions at once. The temple gives and the temple takes. You hear echoes, don't you? Modern institutions do not parade priestly skins through public squares, but they still consecrate a chosen few, feed them at the top table, then throw them off the roof when the narrative demands a sacrifice. They still guard marriage licenses like deeds because contracts create taxes, and taxes build empires. They still regulate bodies with policy, shame with headlines, absolve with PR statements that function like confessions to a goddess who never forgets. Different costumes, same mechanics. What you call culture wars are, at core, state battles over who roots desire. Remember the youth who walked as Tezcatlipoca's reflection, flutes breaking on the steps like bones of music. His 4 brides were not a reward. They were a stage. His final climb wasn't a fall from grace. It was the system revealing its face. The last thing he saw was a blade made of stone that pretended to be night. He died teaching, not history. Compliance. We are going further. Down past festivals where the laughter was real and had a timer on it. Down past codes where the ink is still wet in our own era. Down to the rooms where empire calibrates men. And men either wake up or become part of the furnishing. If this journey is gripping your throat, don't step back. Lean in. You're not just learning about them, you're looking at the blueprint they left in us. Before we go deeper into the rites that braided power into flesh, tap like and subscribe if this unlocks something in you, and drop your city or state in the comments. I want to see this map of watchers grow, pin by pin, until the algorithm has to admit we built a quiet army of men who read the gears behind the mask. Listen to the broom. In the month of Oshpanisli, the Great Sweeping, the city became a household, and the household became a temple. Streets were purified, thresholds scrubbed, altars washed until they gleamed like bone. People say the cleaning was for the gods. No, the gods don't need clean floors. The cleaning taught you who sets the terms. In that same month, a young woman was chosen to carry the face of Tochi, the grandmother, mother of the gods, dressed, instructed, escorted as a living promise of order. She learned to sweep with perfect strokes, to weave with perfect patience, to walk with perfect restraint. All that gentleness led somewhere sharp. Her wedding to the city was consummated by a blade, her breath translated into ritual, her skin lifted as a garment for a priest. The empire taught with paradox, nurture and annihilation braided into a single lesson. Purity is not kind here. It is a command. You need to see the system beneath the spectacle. Sweeping wasn't housekeeping, it was social engineering. The word tlazoli meant disorder, trash, and also sexual excess. Everything that accumulates when people act on impulse. The city removed tlazoli with brooms and with liturgies, with marred scents and with decrees. Desire out of place made the streets dirty and the seasons dangerous. Who defined out of place? The council, the calendar, the men on the steps. That's how the Mexica welded intimacy to authority. They relabeled appetite as infrastructure and enforced cleanliness with knives. Step back and read the calendar the way a strategist does. The Xupahuali, the solar year, assigned moods to months. The Tonal Pahuali, the sacred count, assigned currents to days. Some days invited union, others demanded abstinence. Pairing was not private but scheduled. Abstinence was not restraint but contribution. Wars had their fasts, harvests had their offerings, births had their restrictions, mournings had their boundaries. Break a taboo, and you didn't just risk gossip, you threatened civic weather. You can feel the pressure even now, can't you? The idea that your most intimate choices are visible to the sky and punishable by the plaza. There was a science to it, if we use the word loosely. Tonali, a heat, a soul breath, stored in the head and strengthened by discipline. Spend it recklessly, and you grew dull. Save it, offer it, pour it into the drumbeat and the banner, and you became bright. Young men were told their seed was more than fluid, it was strategy. Young women were told their cycles were more than biology, they were civic clocks. Midwives, the Tlamatl received babies with speeches that welded mother, child, lineage and law together in one breath. The bath that followed, the Temazcal, was healing, yes, but also regulation. Who attended, who permitted, who declared the body clean, these were not casual roles. Even rebirth happened under management. The horror you came for hides in plain sight. A gentled hand guiding a ritual that ends in slaughter. A tender marriage arranged to bind provinces instead of hearts. A young goddess image adored, then silenced. Do not miss the other edge. Mercy weaponized. Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth, offered absolution once, and only once. Men delayed, thought to cash in late, to eat life's sweetness first and wash at the end. Others broke early under the pressure of secrets. The outcome was the same, a single confession that turned a private man into a branded subject. Absolution wasn't a hug, it was a hook. It pulled the forgiven into the temple's orbit for the rest of his days. There were soft rooms inside the iron. The ahuyanime, cultivated companions, learned songs that opened men like locks and captured truths as effectively as any interrogator. Their skill wasn't primarily touch, it was leverage, a glance that made a merchant promise better terms, a verse that turned a captain's pride into a confession. They existed within codes that punished exploitation and disloyalty with severity, not because the state was compassionate, but because the state protected its instruments. Power preserves the tools that increase it. It does so with velvet and with teeth. We have to enter a darker chamber, the rules no one wants to read aloud. Adultery was prosecuted as a civic offence because lineage carried tax and title. Rape was punished by death because it ruptured the thread that tied families to obligations. Incest was erased because it tangled inheritance and invited chaos. The penalties were public and exemplary. You can recoil from their severity. You should. But notice the difference in logic. These weren't morals floating in sermons, they were policies. Everybody was a ledger. Every bed was a contract line. Now the piece that confuses modern readers, the texts that speak with certainty about condemned acts between men or women, or any deviation from the ordained paths. Most of those passages are filtered through friars whose pens burned with zeal and politics. Did the Mexica police all variants with equal fury? The truth is inconveniently complicated. There are signs of tolerated roles at court and in cult, cross-dressed performers in festivals, and then sharp prohibitions in law codes shaped by Spanish hands. The honest position is this. What the empire could not root back into order, it shamed or killed. What it could root, it dressed and paid. Even the dead policed the living. The chihuateteo, the spirits of women who died in childbirth, were feared at crossroads, painted and powder-faced, tempting and punishing in the same breath. Men were warned to avoid them with the same urgency as avoiding unauthorized beds. It sounds like superstition. It was also psychology, the state and the sacred combining to teach men to keep their voltage pointed at approved targets. The fear of ghosts at the crossing is a fear of your own drift. The city used both. And over it all, the festivals where the living gods double walked with 4 brides through a year of music before climbing to the knife. The goddess maiden who swept the city clean before her breath was taken. The priest who wore another's skin, so the people would see renewal as intimacy and intimacy as debt. The horrific part isn't only the cut. It's the fact that millions agreed to the story that made the cut inevitable. That is the oldest trick in the playbook. Turn biology into theology. Turn longing into legislation. Turn pleasure into an IOU. Hold your stare in that obsidian mirror for a moment longer. What do you see behind you? Ads that launder desire into dependency. Entertainment that trains your reflexes. Policies that reward restraint when it's convenient for payrolls and punish it when it disrupts markets. Our era changed the masks, not the method. We don't flay the chosen and wear their skin. We harvest their secrets and wear their reputations for clicks. We don't carry goddess images through the square. We crown influencers for a season and then sweep them away. And we still have absolutions, statements and therapies, rebrandings and returns, offered once and only once before the next punishment arrives. You wanted forbidden history. You're getting anatomy, the guts of a machine that turns men into batteries and women into boundaries, harvests intimacy as tribute, and makes the maintenance of order feel like romance, penance, policy and prayer all at once. In the next descent, we'll step into the chamber where the blade meets the vow, where the sweetest night was engineered to be the last, and where the temple finally tells you, without euphemism, what it thinks you're for. Keep going. The lights dim from here, and your eyes will adjust. You smell it before you understand it, the sweetness of copal and marigold hiding the tang of rot. Spring in Tenochtitlan, the month of Tlacaxi-Pehualistli, the flaying of men, when Saip-Totec, the lord of the flayed, wakes the fields by stripping men of their skins and dressing the city in new flesh. A priest walks past with a second face draped over his own. eye holes staring, lips slack. People reach out because they believe blessing clings to edges, and nothing has an edge like a god's garment stolen from a man. Watch closely. This is sex too, coded, reframed, armoured in ceremony. Renewal through penetration, union through removal, fertility through the unspeakable. The Mexica didn't separate eros from agriculture or law. They braided them, and then they tightened the braid around your throat. The festival begins with a hunt for excellence. Captives of renown tied to the Temala cattle, a great stone where courage is measured with a feathered blade. When the edge finishes its argument, the knife starts its lesson. Skins are lifted, carefully, almost tenderly, washed, treated, then worn by priests who walk the markets and lanes as living avatars of renewal. For 20 days, the city looks at its reflection and sees a wound smiling back. The symbolism isn't subtle. Corn is seed with armour, earth is flesh with a rind, and men become offerings so the world can keep being born. Sex and sowing and slaughter sit at the same table. You can pretend you don't see it. The Empire will teach you until you do. The horror you feel, that recoil in the spine, is the point. Terror is a teacher that never loses your attention. And in this month, the lessons multiply. Those flayed skins, some belong to young women who had been elevated as images of Maze's tender face, Zilonan, hair of the ear, the fresh corn. Dressed as brides, perfumed, praised, escorted, then offered, decapitated, skinned. A priest wore the maid skin so the people could witness the earth's marriage to the city by contact more intimate than touch. There are pages in the Friars' Chronicles that lick their own fear, exaggerating to justify conquest. But even if you shave their rhetoric down to bone, the core remains. Union was dramatised as consumption, fertility as transformed flesh, devotion as the right to wear someone else. The state turned intimacy into a costume, consecrated and controlled. You think pleasure means choice. Power thinks pleasure means leverage. That's why licensed bawdy songs, the Quequechquicatl, were allowed in certain months and forbidden in others. That's why wine was a sacrament for elders and a sin for the young. That's why courtesans trained not only in touch, but in poetry, diplomacy, and silence moved like warm currents through the city's elite. The Ahuianime weren't chaos. They were instruments, made, managed, and protected because they maintained pressure, redirected loyalties, and harvested intelligence. When a man left their doorway, he had been relieved and recorded all at once. Listen to the midwives, the Tlamatl Quiticital, speaking to a newborn girl. Your place is the hearth and the loom. You will walk straight, speak clean, keep order. Then to a newborn boy. You were born to the shield and spear. Your seed is sun heat. Your sleep belongs to the drum. These aren't lullabies. They are operating manuals, taboos about when to lie together after birth, seasons of abstinence before war, days when unions are auspicious, and days when they are forbidden. These are not quaint superstitions. They are calibration. Everybody in the city was tuned to a calendar, and the calendar belonged to priests and councils, not to private hearts. In Tlacaxipehuelitztli, the flayed priests approached households as givers of renewal. They accepted alms, blessed markets, stood in doorways where young couples peeked out from shadows, trembling and fascinated. Imagine being a new husband then, a young wife, watching a walking symbol of shed skin, a new life pause by your threshold. Fear curdles into devotion. Devotion cements into obedience. You will keep the codes. You will honour the timetable. You will root your appetite where it is wanted and withhold it where it is forbidden. Not because a man barked an order, but because reality itself felt arranged that way. That is the best cage, the one that looks like the world. There is a line in the Florentine Codex, compiled by Sahagún with indigenous informants, that describes the laws around adultery with the same pitiless clarity as a drought. Death by strangulation, by stoning, by club, public spectacle. So the city learns through your body. You can call it cruelty. It is. You can also call it strategy. Lineage is tax and title are the arteries of empire. Rape was prosecuted not with fines but with annihilation, not because the state loved victims, but because the state loved continuity. Incest ruptured inheritance flows and so was erased with fury. There is no softness in this logic. There is only order and what defies it. What about male devotion and blood? We touched it briefly, the cord of thorns drawn through the tongue, the ear, and sometimes the organ that writes lineage into the future. This wasn't pornography. It was covenant. Men signed their vows with their most charged blood, promising their vitality to gods of war, maize and midnight. The message was not whispered. The best of you belongs in public hands. Save your fire for banners and altars. The rest, the small hearth, the private room, exists by permission, not by right. Is everything we've said free of debate? No, the sources argue with each other, and colonial agendas stain the pages. Some friars painted sex in Tenochtitlan as bottomless vice to justify their mission. Others stared too long at the knife and missed the civic logic. A disciplined mind holds both. But look at the architecture that doesn't care who is writing. The schools, the laws, the festivals, the market districts, the way marriage braided clans across provinces, the way mercy itself, confession to Tlazolteotl, was granted once and only once. As if to say, we can unchain you, but you belong to the hand that holds the key. We have reached the staircase's landing, the middle point where men either wake up or fall asleep with their eyes open. So I'm going to mark this moment and brand it into memory. If you're still with me, you are not a tourist. You're a builder of sovereignty. Go to the comments and write this twice, exactly as you claim it. No altar owns me. No altar owns me. The repetition is not for the algorithm alone. It's for your nervous system. You are drawing a line the priests in any age can see. And because this channel is more than a monologue, fold yourself into the circle we're making across borders and time. If the descent is sharpening you, hit like and subscribe so the next door opens when it should, and drop your city or state. I want to see these pins stacked from coast to coast, a quiet map of men who refuse to be harvested. We are not done with Sipe Totec. The Lord of the Flayed is a mirror for any culture that thinks renewal requires a victim. The Mexica displayed the truth openly. The priest wears the skin of the chosen and calls it spring. We hide the same dynamic in kinder words. We call it closure, discipline, content moderation. We pick a famous face. Let him feast among 4 metaphorical brides: status, access, abundance, exemption. And then we pull the rug when his usefulness wanes. We say it's justice. Sometimes it is. Often it's theatre. Either way, the crowd learns obedience through someone else's fall. Return to the market one last time before we descend again. A flayed priest accepts a handful of flowers from a girl with ribboned hair. Nearby, a nobleman laughs too loudly at a courtesan's pun, then drops his voice to whisper the thing he shouldn't say out loud. A midwife passes, stern and luminous, because she knows something all men have to relearn. Birth is a battlefield, too, and the city assigns its medals early. Over them all, the calendar turns its stone pages. Days of license, days of restraint, nights when the young sing with wicked tongues they'll bite clean by dawn. And the temple stands, patient, because it knows every spectrum of desire can be bent into a circle that returns to its door. You ask for the most horrific sexual practices. The blade is obvious, the costumes shock. But the deepest horror is not the cut. It's the consent to a story that eats you and calls the devouring sacred. In the next chamber, we will walk into Toxcatl, the famine-scented month of Tezcatlipoca's double, and stand closer than comfort to a youth whose last embrace was a city's trap disguised as paradise. We will also stare down another sanctum, the school where boys and girls learn that admiration is a leash, confession is a chain, and loyalty is a bed with someone else's name on it. Keep your feet under you. The mirror gets darker, and the lessons get sharper. Toxcatl begins with a stillness that lies. No breeze, no birdsong. Only the tick of sandals on stone as he walks, the living mirror of Tezcatlipoca, through streets that hold their breath. His hair is oiled, parted with care. His face is flawless in the old texts, because flaws break spells. For a year he has eaten little and never hurried. He learned instruments and carried flowers. He greeted nobles and beggars with the same slow smile that said, "The night is watching you through me." In the final 20 days, the chronicles say he is given 4 women named for goddesses. names that mean blossom, fragrance, joy, and song. He moves into a house heavy with perfume and music. To the crowd, this looks like victory. A man raised above men, chosen for pleasures forbidden to most. But if you read the ritual as a strategist, you see a lock disguised as a crown. The brides are a corridor, not a reward. The last embrace is a leash tied to the steps. He isn't alone in that house. Priests hover like shadows against the white walls, keepers of exactness. His clothes change by decree. White, then red, then black, then blue. Cosmic colours stitched with meanings he did not invent. Every gesture is scripted. Every glimpse of tenderness, a lesson calibrated to the city's nervous system. Because everyone is watching. Young men dream in secret of the honour of being chosen. Their desire for status trained to outshine their desire for breath. Young women study the brides with hungry eyes. Power looks like softness they could wear. And the elders nod, because the play has worked again. It grafts complicity to awe. The most intimate privileges are granted by the same hand that will take his head. The empire pours honey on the blade, and the blade does its work perfectly. The final morning, he mounts the steps with flutes that he snaps one by one against the stone. The music breaks like thin moans. A priest meets him. There's a moment, always a moment, when the chosen could refuse. But you don't spend a year walking as a god and then say no. The story is stronger than muscle. A few breaths later, the city has learned again what it is meant to learn. Desire is a road that ends at the temple. If you understand that, you understand why this practice is more than horror. It is a manual. The women aren't props. They are symbols of sanctioned abundance. A compressed lifetime offered in a month, and their presence brands the lesson deeper. The sweetest night belongs to the institution that grants it. Now widen the frame. The Huey, Tlatoani, the great speaker, does not rule alone. He rules from a house that is an ecosystem. Marriages braid provinces into family. Noble daughters become living treaties. Concubines and companions form a lattice of influence around the throne. Some chroniclers, especially those writing to shock their patrons, call it a harem. That word imports foreign fantasies. What's factual is the configuration. Multiple unions, ranked and regulated, each with duty and privilege, each inscribed into law. The palace is a city of rooms with different permissions. The wives who matter most are the ones whose blood or allegiance secures grain, warriors, and calm borders. The private is public. The bed is a border stone. Punishment is not random, it is a sculptor. Adultery that tangles the lines of inheritance invites execution because it jeopardizes tribute flows. A noble who steals another man's wife does not embarrass a rival. He risks destabilizing a district. The penalty teaches all classes at once. Your pleasures have perimeter fences, painted invisible. And if you walk past them, the square will teach you to see. The same logic touches intoxicants. Pulque for elders as medicine and ritual. Punishment for the young because fog in the mind at the wrong season is weakness, where the state needs heat. Licensed bawdy songs erupt in specific months, then vanish under threat. Laughter is legal only when it strengthens the weave. Enter the chamber. Men avoid thinking about auto-sacrifice, where devotion is signed in blood pulled from the most symbolic parts of the body. Tongue, ear, and, when vow requires, where lineage writes its message into the future. Maguey spines, obsidian shards, cords, laced with thorns. The point is not pain for its own sake. It's economy. You promise your vitality publicly. You root your force into a calendar that converts it into victories and rain. Warriors abstain before campaign, not because stoicism is a poem, but because unspent force hits harder. Husbands abstain after birth, because the household's heat must coil around the newborn like a shield. Everything is staged, everything is intentional. Your body is a power plant, and the grid belongs to the city. Now the house of song, the Quica Kali, where youth are drilled in music that carries two tempos, the clean hymns of devotion and the licentious rhythms unleashed in sanctioned bursts. Knowledge of both is control. Men trained to navigate arousal without derailing their duties become more reliable weapons. Women trained to wield charm without wrecking alliances become more potent diplomats. The Ahuyanime move through this house and the markets and the courts, with licenses pinned to their elegance. They are punished with ferocity if they break rank, not out of kindness to their clients, but out of respect for the instrument they have become. Power respects the tools that enlarge it, and it enforces that respect with both perfume and prison. You want accuracy more than gossip, so hold this with two hands. Claims of sacred prostitution in Aztec temples make good fundraising for friars, but archaeology is colder. We can say there were regulated spaces for courtesans, houses of song, rules that constrained and protected high-status companions. We can suspect intelligence gathering and pressure applied by velvet. We can detect marriages arranged as statecraft and women moved by alliance and tribute. We cannot pretend every lurid detail painted by conquerors is gospel, and yet the heart of it, sexual economy as machinery, stands. Even myths speak the code. Xochiquetzal, flower-feathered, patron of seduction and craft, stolen by Tezcatlipoca in a story that warns artisans and lovers alike. Beauty attracts appetite from the top of the pantheon down. Malinalxochitl, sorceress of the desert, abandoned by her brother Huitzilopochtli when desire and disorder threatened the migration's spine. Chihuateteo, the spirit women dead in childbirth, haunting crossroads to punish men who stray. These are not bedtime tales. They are carved caution signs that turn wanderlust and lust itself back towards sanctioned paths. If you want to feel the hand on your shoulder, imagine you're 20, disciplined, powerful, your name rising in the Telpachkali lists. A patron suggests the palace is watching. You are seen. The next month, you're invited to train as an attendant to the god's double. You begin to glow with proximity. Food tastes richer. Doors open before you reach them. Then you see it. The line in the ceiling that ends at a blade. Do you turn away? Or do you tell yourself that a year as a living god is worth a quiet grave? The Empire has found the seam in your armour, the place where your hunger for significance eclipses your survival. This is the most horrific sexual practice of all, the transformation of intimacy into bait for compliance, the use of your longing for union with a woman, with a city, with a god, to guide you to a death you will call glorious. If this descent is hitting nerves you didn't know you had, good. That sensation is your awareness waking up in a room it didn't know existed. And because this is a circle of men mapping forbidden terrain together, do two things that strengthen the signal. Hit like and subscribe so you don't lose the trail when the next door opens. And drop your city or state in the comments. I want to see the map of watchers widen until it looks like a constellation the priests cannot chart. One more angle before we move. Health as governance. Midwives enforcing abstinence timelines weren't only healers. They were compliance officers wrapped in tenderness. Bathhouses timed to seasons were also calendars of control. The temazcal, after war, after birth, after sin, rebirth that smells like herbs and feels like mercy, was also a checkpoint. Who permitted, who supervised, who declared you clean? The same structure that punished could absolve. An absolution creates loyalty deeper than fear. Tlazolteotl's priests knew it. A confession granted once binds a man forever. He will defend the hand that wiped his guilt because the memory of relief is addictive. Stand at the edge of the lake and look back at the city as dusk turns the walls to bronze. Somewhere inside, the god's double lays his head on a mat he will not use again. Somewhere else, a bride selected for a goddess's role stares at a ceiling she will never see a second time. In the market, a courtesan laughs and listens, fixing two futures with a single phrase. In a bathhouse, a healer opens a door and closes a vow. None of this is accident. All of it is architecture, and you are learning to read the blueprint. Next, we step into the palace corridors where alliances are consummated in rooms with two doors, one that opens to banquets and one that opens to war. We'll examine how a ruler's household became a map of empire, how enforcement travelled through intimacy faster than through armies, and how the story snapped when a different empire arrived with its own obsidian under a different name. Keep your back straight. The mirror is about to show you yourself. The palace is not a building. It's a map of pressure points. Hallways where whispers carry farther than drums. Chambers where doors open inward for love and outward for war. Candles bloom in niches like captive stars. You smell cacao and copal. Hear laughter muffled by rules. Hear the Huey Tlatoani sits at the junction of bloodlines and borders. And his household is the instrument that tunes the empire. A marriage is a treaty with silk on it. A concubine is a courier dressed as a dream. A daughter betrothed across a lake is a bridge you can walk an army across if the time comes. The horror most men miss is simple. Private life in Tenochtitlan wasn't private. It was a control panel disguised as a family tree. Look closely at the architecture of wives and companions. European chroniclers used their own vocabulary, harem, seraglio, words that fog the lens. Strip away projection, and you still find multiplicity managed with precision. A principal wife anchors lineage, her children positioned nearest the throne of inheritance. Secondary wives and honoured companions, some gifts from allied towns, some daughters of noble houses, some taken as tribute from provinces, populate a lattice of obligations as real as any canal or causeway. These women are not interchangeable. Each comes with a dowry of loyalties, a governor's goodwill, a market's stability, a cohort of warriors who will answer the palace trumpet because their cousin sleeps under the ruler's roof. The bed becomes a border stone stamped by ritual, and ritual never sleeps. In Panquetzalisli, banners rise for Huitzilopochtli, and the court reorganises itself into choreography. The ruler's household performs devotion in layers, abstinence before the campaign season to coil force, sanctioned feasts after victory to release it in controlled arcs. Marriage is announced on auspicious days so that sons arrive on calendars the priests approve. At each turn, the body is rooted into policy. When the codices list tribute, cotton mantles, cacao, obsidian blades, they also list people. The cold ink makes a hot point. Provinces didn't only send goods, they sent human futures. The word you need is Ichiptla, image, representative, god body. Everyone remembers the youth who walked as Tezcatlipoca and died with a flute broken in his hand. Fewer remember the women who became corn's face before their breath was claimed, or the boys who carried banners as living omens for upcoming wars, or the weavers and singers who embodied patron gods in festivals, carrying a grace period that always ended in after. In each case, intimacy, touch, gaze, hunger, was turned toward an image that drained it upward. The chosen learned to smile through the script because the script was stronger than any single life. That's how a symbol eats a city, and how a city agrees to be eaten. Policies sharpened the teeth of those symbols. The law didn't ask you to be good, it demanded you be legible. Adultery wasn't sin, as a sermon understands it. It was sabotage against clarity of succession. Rape wasn't just cruelty, it was a tear in the fabric that aligns families to tribute obligations. Incest didn't merely offend, it knotted inheritance flows in ways that threatened the tax map. The punishments, execution by club or stone, strangulation, public tearing of garments, shaved heads, parades of shame, were less about revenge than about engraving the boundaries into memory. You learned, or you were removed like a cracked tile. Men's bodies were pledged with the same bookkeeping. Auto-sacrifice in the Kalmakak and Telpoch Kali wasn't masochism. It was contract law written in blood that carried the most symbolism. The tongue that speaks vows, the ears that receive orders, and the instrument that writes lineage forward. You gave drops to the paper and the brazier, making a receipt the gods would recognise. Abstinence before war, after birth, during sacred windows. These weren't moral panics. They were load management. A city that can throttle its appetites can also throttle its armies and its harvest, shifting voltage where it needs it most. Inside the palace, enforcement wore a friendly face, old women with eyes like needles, duennas of lineage, midwives with seniority, aunts whose gossip carried to the council chamber within the hour. They knew who was tempted, who had faltered, who needed a ritual to reset the ledger. Tlazolteotl's priests, the absolvers, were not soft, but they were necessary. The once-in-a-lifetime confession that lifted a man's shame returned him to the grid. Forgiveness, granted in a low room that smelled like herbs and steam, was also registration. The forgiven are grateful, and gratitude is the easiest rope to hold. Outside those rooms, the Ahuyanime glided like warm fronts across the city's high air. Their houses were curated, musicians, poets, discreet servants who knew which cup to refill and which sentence to pretend they didn't hear. They remembered names and debts better than clerks. They could lean a negotiation, with a sigh, with a well-timed silence without anyone calling it coercion. That's why they were protected and punished with equal ferocity. They were not chaos, they were valves. The state does not break its own valves, it polishes them and locks them when necessary. Now, the most intimate lever, birth, the tlamatal quiticital, midwives with steel in their hands and scripture in their voices, ran the frontier between private tears and public order. A girl was rinsed and placed in the shadow of weaving tools, given speeches that fused tenderness with command. You are the spine of the house. You will keep the ash neat and the stories straight. A boy was rinsed beside a tiny shield, and darts told he was born into a war that never ends. The war to feed the sun, the war to keep the maize awake. The war to keep the city's name spoken in other cities with a certain tone. After birth, abstinence timed to healing became law enforced by those women. They could be gentle. They could also be the state with a bowl of warm water. Do you see how seamless it is? Festivals that look like explosions of joy are timers with knives hidden in the confetti. Codes that sound like sermons are spreadsheets for blood and property. Marriages that feel like love to the two, who kneel resemble bridges to the men drawing maps upstairs. The palace is a regulator that hums under the music. It can grant a year as a god, a month as a goddess, a house in the quarter where songs go blue, and it can take all of it back with a look. When you master this blueprint, you stop being distracted by masks. You start reading currents. There's a silence in the archives no one talks about. What women said to each other when no friar or lord was listening. How they negotiated within the cage. How they used ritual to bend the bars for a niece. How a courtesan shielded a client she believed in by steering him from a conversation that would have ended his career. Not all power flowed downhill. Some pooled in corners where it warmed the frozen. The empire's cynicism was vast. It wasn't total. That matters. Agency survived, even if the accounts we have refuse to write it down. Now picture the moment the air changes. Foreigner sails on the lake, iron ringing on decks, banners with a strange god nailed into cloth. A new story arrives, armed and hungry, and it carries its own sexual politics. A hunger to label the old world's practices abominations. A hunger to exploit the same appetites it condemns. A need to rearrange marriage and blood to fit a new tax code. A fresh calendar of permitted pleasures and licensed shames. Conquest is always a purge of one ritual and the installation of another. The blade changes shape, the logic persists. The palace doors will be broken, but the control panels behind them will be rebuilt, differently, harshly, with new words that claim the same human currents and route them to a new centre. Before we take that turn and stare into the collision, the friar's ink, the soldier's appetites, the bureaucrat's census that turns bodies into boxes, hold your ground in this hall a breath longer. The Aztec machine of intimacy was not rumour, it was architecture. Every sweep of Oxpanizli, every flayed skin of Tlacaxipehualisli, every flute snapped on Toxcatl steps, every bath of the Temazcal, every marriage knotted by elders, every confession granted once, the parts mesh. They created order that fed millions and a terror that pacified them. Call it monstrous and you won't be wrong. Call it brilliant and you won't be wrong. Call it both and you might finally be ready to see what comes next. If this descent is sharpening your vision, if the palace corridors now look like circuits, support the work so it reaches the men who need it. Hit like and subscribe, and drop your city or state in the comments. I want a constellation of watchers lighting up across the map. Each pin a reminder that knowledge is an oath we keep together. We go now into the fracture, when two empires stare at each other across a courtyard and reach for the same lever, your desire. One will call the other savage. One will call the other false. Both will build rules about who may touch whom, when, where, and at what cost. Both will make forgiveness a product and confession a leash. The names on the doors will change. The mechanism won't. Keep your jaw set. The mirror is about to show you how conquest weaponizes purity and plants new seeds in the old soil. The lake shivers with new sails. Iron moves where reeds once only whispered, and the city that believed it had mastered desire meets men who mastered gunpowder and paper contracts. They arrive with crosses held high and knives tucked low, and they look at Tenochtitlan's machinery of intimacy with a stare that says, "We will rename your gears." Conquest is the most intimate invasion. It doesn't just take land, it takes the right to define purity. Overnight, courtyards become courtrooms. Priests who once wore skins now wear black robes. The knife becomes parchment. The exiptler becomes heretic or convert, depending on whether he kneels. Do not romanticize the collision. The story people sell of love born between conqueror and interpreter hides a harder truth. Alliances brokered by fear, vows translated under duress, bodies leveraged to unlock cities. Melintzin, Doña Marina to their tongues, was not a mythic lover. She was an instrument in a world that turned women into treaties. Her brilliance as a linguist, her survival as a strategist, cannot erase the coercion baked into the arrangement. The Spanish needed a voice to unspool the empire's defences. She became that voice, and out of her body came a future that would be written as mestizo, a word that turned birth into a category on a ledger. The new order arrived with its own confessional, its own absolution economy. Indigenous confession to Tlazolteotl, once and you're bound, was rebadged as sacrament to a different god, administered weekly, seasonally, yearly, under a kneeling posture and a watched timetable. The friars brought mercy, yes, a sincere desire to rescue souls, and also an exquisite tool, a booth where the empire could inventory private life. Who slept where? Who broke which vow? Who strayed from monogamy? Who drank beyond the sanctioned measure? You said your sins in a whisper. You were filed in ink. The old machine of absolution and allegiance did not die. It changed uniforms. Spanish law declared monogamy the divine pattern and polygyny a sin to be burned out. Noble houses scrambled to reorder lineages under the new moral code. Principal wives were elevated. Secondary wives and companions were dismissed, remapped as servants or concubines in the shadows, or baptized into hurried marriages that squared the ledger before the census arrived. Did the conquerors stop bedding indigenous women? They did not. They simply revised the language. Keepers, household, protection, honour. Euphemisms that shrouded coercion while claiming the moral high ground. The same men who condemned Aztec abominations erected brothels under municipal license and built houses of recogimiento to imprison the very women they could not stop desiring, calling it reform. Pulque, the maguey's milk, shifted from ritual drink to moral battlefield. The 400 rabbits, drunkenness gods with rabbit ears in the old myth, were driven underground. Taverns were licensed, hours mandated, classes separated. Alcohol, like sex, became taxable, traceable, punishable. Temazcales, steam baths that had braided healing to regulation, fell under suspicion as dens of immodesty. Some were shuttered. Others survived by adopting saints' names and prayers that satisfied the new inspectors. Bloodletting, the old covenant, was outlawed as diabolical, replaced by penance and arms under the gaze of men who spoke Latin and wielded the Inquisition's quill. The casta system grew like a vine around the ruins, a taxonomy of birth that pretended to be science, but operated as leverage. Español with India yields mestizo. Mestizo with Español yields castizo, and so on, mapping unions into boxes that decided taxes, jobs, punishments, and privileges. The old preoccupation with lineage clarity under Aztec law did not vanish. It intensified under a different name. Baptismal records, marriage licenses, censuses, and court depositions replaced the plaza spectacle as the theatre where private life was judged. Adultery trials moved from the stone steps to ecclesiastical courts. Punishments traded execution for whipping, exile, or public shaming. But the lesson remained. Your body's choices are entries in the empire's account book. The missionaries did not only suppress, they transmuted. Sacred songs became villancicos. Festival dances lost their blue edges and donned Marian veils. Xochiquetzal's embroidery guilds became confraternities under saints' banners. Women who had moved as velvet leavers in the old court reappeared as patrons of charitable sodalities, their diplomacy rebaptized as piety. Midwives learned to cross themselves before the speeches they still gave, baptizing infants at the threshold with water blessed by someone new, enforcing abstinence calendars now justified as Christian modesty rather than cosmic load management. The logic of regulation endured. The iconography changed. Do not let conquistador diaries lie to you. They exaggerate what needed condemning and silence what would condemn themselves. They call the aoyanime public women and then spend nights in their company. They paint indigenous dances as orgies and then legislate Spanish carnivals into sanctified time. They skewer human sacrifice in paragraphs that conveniently forget the rapes recorded in the same campaigns. If you're going to be a man who reads power instead of slogans, you have to hold two truths at once. Aztec systems braided intimacy to authority with ruthless brilliance, and the Spanish replaced them with a regime that did the same in a different dialect. Confession instead of auto-sacrifice. Marriage licenses instead of elder-knotted cloth. Monogamy enforced on paper, while concubinage thrived in parlours. The Inquisition's shadow lengthened over bedrooms and bathhouses alike. It burned sodomites, flogged adulterers, exiled bigamists, and policed rumours with a zeal that felt holy to those who wielded it. The old Aztec severity toward acts that unravelled lineage and tribute found a mirror. Colonial courts framed the same acts as offences against divine and social order. The result was familiar. Public discipline designed to produce private compliance. Even deviance served the machine. Every confession augmented the state's knowledge graph. Every penance acquired another thread of loyalty, stitched by fear and relief. There was resistance, always. Families kept old calendars under new names. Women traded recipes for medicine and secrecy across kitchen thresholds that outlasted regimes. Some bathhouses hid in plain sight, replaced idols with candles, spoke prayers in Nahuatl beneath a Latin refrain, and continued to time abstinence to healing rather than to some friar's timetable. Courtesans reinvented themselves as salonières, hosting conversations that threaded influence through lace instead of feathers. These strategies mattered. They didn't topple the new order. They made survival inside it possible. The palace map warped but persisted. Spanish governors married into surviving noble lines, inherited tribute through baptized contracts, and installed their own domestic lattices. Legitimate wives at the top, protected women along the sides, an unofficial network of maternity that complicated every inheritance case. The Plaza Mayor learned a new choreography. Processions for Corpus Christi, feasts for the Virgin, autos de fe where the machinery of shame performed itself with theatre, refined over centuries in Iberia. If you looked straight through the costumes, you could still see the mechanism the Mexico had built, and the Spaniards now operated. Regulate desire, root intimacy, harvest compliance, absolve on schedule, punish publicly, record everything. Step back and judge carefully. The old empire's most horrific sexual practice was not just the knife, it was the yoking of eros to altar and ledger. The new empire's most horrific practice was not only rape during conquest or hypocrisy after, it was the moralised bureaucracy that made bodies legible to a crown across an ocean and called the visibility virtue. 2 machines, 2 vocabularies, 1 impulse, to take the heat in the human animal and plug it into a grid that lights the capital. If tracing this has sharpened your sight, if you can feel how rituals, laws and stories shepherded private life into public hands, then stay with me into the last descent. We'll step out of the archives and into your daily room, where screens replace codices, terms of service replace temple codes, and absolution arrives as a "We value your privacy" banner. You click in exchange for attention you don't know you're paying. Before we enter that mirror, strengthen the signal. If this exploration is giving you vocabulary for things you've only felt, hit like and subscribe so we can keep this work alive. And add your city or state in the comments. I want to see the map of men forming coast to coast and beyond, names on a wall of resolve instead of a wall of skulls. We end the historical descent here because the next step is the present tense. 4 brides have new faces now. Status, access, novelty, exemption. They are offered before the blade falls, and most men still walk smiling to the steps. If you've learned anything from Tenochtitlan, and from Spain, learn this. The story that grants you sweetness is usually the story that owns the knife. Set the codices down. Step out of the pyramid's shadow. Now look at the glow in your palm. That rectangle hums like a shrine. Silent, hungry, merciful when it wants to be, punitive when it must. If Tenochtitlan taught men that desire is a civic current rooted by priests, your age teaches the same lesson through code. The algorithm is a calendar that nobody shows you. It schedules your temptations, times your releases, and calls it personalization. The feed is a market of Aoi anime, with pixel faces, trained to sing the songs that unlock you. The platform forgives you for yesterday's outburst and buries you for tomorrow's misstep with a priest's calm. Tell yourself we've changed. The mask has, the machine hasn't. Listen to the new flutes. They sound like notifications. Their music rewards you with 4 brides. Status, access, novelty, exemption. For a year, for a season, for a hot hour, you are crowned with attention. You dine with brands, you get rooms in the palace of verification. Your DMs become corridors full of open doors. Then the ritual concludes. You break the flutes yourself in a teary apology video or find them broken for you in a thread that was prepared weeks ago. The city learns from your collapse. The lesson is not justice. The lesson is compliance. Love what the temple loans you, and remember it can take it back whenever the story needs a body. What about confession? You still kneel, just not in a stone room. You pour your secrets into captions and comment boxes, or into forms that promise privacy and mean property. You're absolved with likes, with brand-safe absolution language, with a therapist's script that becomes a template for content. Relief washes over you like steam in a temazcal. The ledger updates behind your back. Data never forgets. Forgiveness is a feature. Loyalty is a subscription. The thing you called freedom is an onboarding flow. Fertility rights? They went corporate. Wellness calendars decide when you fast, when you feast, when you sleep, when you detox. Devices tell you when to lie together for optimal results, and the state reaches in with benefits and penalties that align your family to its tax map. Midwives still guard thresholds. Some wear scrubs, some wear HR badges. They time your return to work with the same cool calculus as the old women in the palace. Heal enough to be useful. Abstain until the metrics say resume. It sounds modern. It is. It's also familiar. You don't need priests in flayed skins when you have public shaming at scale. Doxing is a kind of skinning, privacy stripped, identity worn by strangers who parade you around the square. Cancellation is talakaksi pehualistli, without the incense. 20 days compressed into a 20-minute frenzy. Okpanisli, the sweeping month, became content moderation. The broom is an algorithmic filter that clears the square of what the council declares plazoli. Disorder, trash, the wrong desire spoken too loud. Sometimes the sweep makes streets safer. Sometimes it makes them sterile enough to control. Marriages, the palace still chooses, only now the palace is corporate. Contracts bind you to health insurance, mortgages, and jurisdictions that decide what your promises mean. The private ceremony in your heart lives in a courthouse file that turns affection into a revenue stream. Adultery won't get you stoned in the plaza, but it can vaporize assets, crush custody, and reorder the map of who sleeps where, like a miniature civil war. The punishment moved from club and stone to clause and settlement. The logic is unchanged. Lineages must be legible to feed the machine. And the Ahui anime, they survive by changing their wardrobe. Influencers and escorts and coaches ply the same craft, the design of attention. Some are honourable, some predatory. Most are instruments in a music they did not compose. Their salons are platforms, their patrons are sponsors, their punishments are bans and demonetization. The state protects them at times, prosecutes them at others, always keeping the lever close, because nothing roots male loyalty like well-managed allure. You can despise that fact. It still moves armies. So what does a man do? Not retreat into bitterness. Build sovereignty. The Mexica taught discipline with stakes too brutal to copy. But the architecture of self-mastery remains sound if you strip out the knife. Write your own calendar. Choose windows of abstinence and indulgence, and defend them like a city wall. If you don't schedule your appetite, someone else will. Reclaim confession. Keep counsel with a tight brotherhood, men who hold your secrets without selling them. Your data is your blood. Don't give it to a god that publishes. Control inputs. Curate your feeds until they are boring enough to sharpen you and brutal enough to wake you. The algorithm is a priest, make it a servant. Guard vows. Whether marriage or mission, let your promises be few and enforced. The empire exploited broken men. Don't be a rich vein in someone else's mine. Practice ritual on your terms. Cold mornings, hard training, real fasting, considered feasting. Tonali, the heat in you, grows when you cut the leeks. Read every contract like it's a sacrificial stone. If the clause gives sweet privileges, find the blade. Privilege is the corridor. The invoice is the altar. See through the four brides. Status is rented. Access is bait. Novelty is a pacifier. Exemption is a rumour. Break their flutes before someone does it for you. Protect women. The old machine used them as treaties and costumes. The new one uses them as content and cover. Refuse both. Make your home a jurisdiction of honour where consent is real and promises have teeth. Build parallel altars. A craft, a code, a community that doesn't sell you to the square. The state can tax your income. Don't let it tax your soul. You are not an Aztec. You are not a Spaniard. You live in a world that borrows power moves from both. If you woke up in these 8 rooms to how desire becomes a leash, then choose the hard turn. Be the man who roots his heat where he decides. Be the ruler of a small palace whose doors open inward to love and outward to necessary war, a palace that sells no one to anyone. Understand this, I'm not here to sneer at ancestors or baptize their knives. I'm here to hand you a mirror and point at the hand behind your shoulder. Cultures change, gears recur. The Mexica's most horrific sexual practice was to make intimacy a civic sacrament, enforced by death. Your age baptized the same practice with policy, commerce, and code. The cost is lower in blood, higher in attention. The harvest is quieter. The yield is obedience dressed as preference. Before we close this descent, strengthen the signal. If this journey stripped the paint off old myths and showed you the gears beneath, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city or state in the comments. I want to see this map of men, New York to Boise, Miami to Anchorage, standing shoulder to shoulder in a quiet brotherhood of clear eyes, walk out onto the nighttime balcony. The lake is gone, but the wind still carries a taste of copal if you know memory's smell. Somewhere far beneath the pavement, marigold roots remember feet that walk to drums. Somewhere inside you, a boy raised in a Telpoch Kali you never attended wants someone to set the schedule for him, to tell him when to fight and when to love, when to drink and when to fast. Tell him no. Teach him to write the calendar on his own bones. The city you live in, screen-lit, efficient, merciful when convenient, will keep offering you corridors carpeted with petals. Walk them if you want, but check the walls for scratch marks that look like flutes. Check the ceiling for a blade shaped like a brand deal. Check the door for hinges that open only one way. If you must marry the city, marry it with your eyes open and your hands on the contract. Better yet, keep your true marriage for what deserves it. A woman who can carry your name without losing her own. A craft that can carry your house through storms. A code that can carry your son past every altar. No altar owns you unless you hand it the rope. You know that now. Keep the vow you wrote halfway down these stairs. Let it orbit you like a ward. The priests in any age will see it and hesitate. That hesitation is your window. Step through.